Good afternoon and welcome to the CDP webinar, Hurricane Florence, What's Next? Hi everybody, I'm Bob Ottenhoff, President and CEO of the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. Thanks so much for joining us today. I want to thank the UPS Foundation for their generous support of our webinar series. And I want to welcome our sponsors, the Council on Foundations, the Southeast Council of Foundations, the Environmental Grantmakers Association, and the Funders Network for Smart Growth and Livable Communities. Thanks for joining us. A couple of reminders before we get started. This webinar is being recorded and we'll make it available later on CDP's website and to any of you also interested in the recording. You can submit questions at any time using the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we'll do our best to answer your questions during the webinar. If you're on Twitter, please use hashtag CDP4Recovery to share the discussion. Our subject today is Hurricane Florence. Hurricane Florence has continued to affect large parts of the east coast of the United States. Over 9 million people are still under flood warnings. Many roads are still impassable. Some rivers are still rising and won't crest until the weekend. And major flood stage will continue into next week for several locations. Extensive flooding has caused 32 deaths so far, 25 in North Carolina. Approximately 500,000 households were without power as of this morning. And last night, little more than 12,000 people spent the night in nearly 140 community and Red Cross shelters. As the Washington Post put it today, misery in the Carolinas might be many days off from cresting. Misery may be many days off from cresting. It will be weeks before we know the true outcome of damages caused by Florence, but we thought it was important to convene this webinar sooner rather than later, so we could begin to explore how philanthropy can best be responsive. So far, philanthropic funds raised for response are far lower than what will be needed to help communities recover. To update us on relief work in the affected areas and what funders can do to help, we have with us today Eric Nankervis, who serves as FEMA's Voluntary Agency Liaison in FEMA's Region 4. In this role, he helps to establish, foster, and maintain relationships among government, voluntary, faith-based, and community partners to strengthen capabilities and support the delivery of services. Greg Forrester is the President and CEO of the National Voluntary Organizations Active in Disasters, NVOAD. Greg's been working with volunteers, community development, and disaster response recovery for over 30 years. National VOAD is an association of organizations that mitigate and alleviate the impact of disasters. Rhett Boney is the Executive Director of North Carolina Network of Grantmakers, and prior to becoming its Executive Director, Rhett covered the charitable world for 8 years throughout North Carolina and the U.S. as Deputy Editor for the Philanthropy Journal. Joanne Turnquist is President and CEO of Central Carolina Community Foundation, which connects donors in the Midlands with a full spectrum of charitable and nonprofit organizations in their communities. Her foundation manages the One South Carolina Fund, which was set up by former Governor Nikki Haley after the 2015 thousand-year flood to support nonprofits to fund relief, recovery, and rebuilding assistance programs from state-declared emergencies. Edie Blakesley is the Vice President of Grant Making and Community Leadership at the Coastal Community Foundation of South Carolina. Coastal Community Foundation helps create vibrant communities by uniting people and investing resources. So welcome and thanks to our panel today for taking time away from your busy schedules and your work in the disaster to speak with us today. Eric, let's get started with you. If you might, could you, from FEMA's perspective, kind of give us the big picture? What's happening today and what's FEMA doing in North Carolina in particular?
Okay, Bob, sure. Thank you all for being here today. While Florence has moved out of the southeast, the impacts of the storm has left on the Carolinas is only beginning to be seen and felt. As Bob mentioned, flooding remains a large concern as water begins to travel down rivers that are already at major flood levels. Roadways and bridges have been washed out across the region, causing some areas within both North and South Carolina to be isolated. Evacuation shelters are starting to close, but we have started to work with our community partners and the American Red Cross to open congregate shelters to be able to have housing options for individuals that were displaced and still may not have a home to go back to. In North Carolina, 18 counties have been declared for individual assistance, and more than 29,000 households have registered for FEMA assistance thus far in North Carolina alone. A determination on a declaration for individual assistance for South Carolina is currently pending. There's a saying in emergency response that this is a marathon, not a sprint. And with this marathon, we don't know how long the distance is. It's not known when the waters will actually subside, and any rain predicted for this coming weekend could keep the rivers high. Many roadways remain closed, so there's the logistical challenge of moving the supplies across the states. FEMA is working with our state, private sector, and nonprofit partners in both the Carolinas to be able to bring food, water, hygiene supplies, and other commodities into isolated communities, and points of distribution are being set up across the state to ensure people get what they need. A lot of attention is being given to population centers that are becoming isolated, such as Wilmington, where only recently have some of the roads open into the community. But there are many rural communities as well that are isolated on a regular basis, and we're trying to do check-ins with those communities to make certain that they get the support that they have. And this is why it's important for FEMA to work with state voluntary organizations active in disaster, or VOADs, and the long-term recovery groups that are formed after disaster, because they're the ones that know what the needs of the community members are and have the resources to be able to ensure that people get what they need after FEMA assistance and state assistance subsides. So we're doing a lot to make certain that people still have shelters, food, and water, but the individual assistance programs, at least within the state of North Carolina, have started to begin. And I do know that the voluntary organizations active in disaster, the VOADs within both states, are meeting on a regular basis to be able to align their resources. So as they're able to go in and do some work, they're making certain that they're well coordinated with the work that they're doing.
So Eric, it sounds like you're still in sort of an immediate response type of mode, right? You talked about shelters and providing food and water. Would you consider it still an immediate, more of a relief stage than a recovery?
We are still considering it within a response stage, making certain that we're moving around the essential life-supporting things such as food, water, hygiene kits, and the such. It's going to be going into more of a recovery moving forward, but you're very much correct that we're still trying to make certain that people are receiving those life-saving essential, such as water, shelter, food.
And Eric, what does it mean when you say you're beginning to close down shelters? How do we interpret that?
So when a disaster such as this happens, we have the evacuation shelters where people are able to go for immediate evacuation from their homes. When an event like this, where there's significant flooding, where there's storm surge from the hurricane, a lot of times areas are inaccessible, and it goes from having an emergency shelter or evacuation shelter where many people may go. These need to go back to their regular places of business or their regular functions. A lot of these evacuation shelters were school gymnasiums, and the local communities are trying to get the schools back open. So we are looking to consolidate some of these shelters and open ones where there will have more services for the disaster survivors to be able to register for FEMA assistance and register for assistance from nonprofit sector and local government. So it's consolidating into larger congregate shelters that provide more services as people see what the damages to their dwellings are.
Got it. Okay, so we're listening right now to Eric Nankervis from FEMA. We're going to turn now to Greg Forrester, President and CEO of the National Voluntary Organizations Active in Disasters. Greg, can you kind of give us a big picture from the VOAD standpoint of what voluntary organizations are doing?
Certainly, Bob. First off, thank you for hosting this. I think it's important information that we get out and really appreciate your partnership. So National VOAD, for those on the line that aren't aware, we're made up of currently 68 national member organizations, and we have an organization in every state and territory around the nation. About 75% of our organizations are in the faith-based sector. So what we like to say is we are already there in the communities when the disaster hits. With North and South Carolina, as we watched the storm unfold, we started holding meetings with our North and South Carolina VOADs, actually Virginia VOAD, and at the time also Georgia VOAD, starting last Tuesday. So when FEMA stood up their operations center, we also activated at the same time to start to coordinate people and resources and get them staged into areas where we felt the storm was going to hit based on the estimates at the time. Since then, since the storm has struck, we've been holding coordinating calls each day. In North Carolina, it takes place normally at 1 in the afternoon. They've broken out into actual task groups. So we have a group that does with volunteering, another one with housing, another one with mass care, another with donations. And so they actually coordinate then each of those separate functions alongside of local, state, and federal emergency management to try and identify where the gaps currently exist. Right now on the ground in North Carolina, we have about 24 of our national member organizations that are providing sheltering, feeding, and also some debris cleanup work that's starting off to get the roadways back open again. And so we have chainsaw crews, we have muck out crews, and various other specialty type teams that can go ahead and assist in all types of response. As Eric stated, this is an ongoing disaster. We've already had to move some of our member organizations out of areas where they had stood up operations and the flood waters rose. And so this is still an ongoing and unfolding disaster. As I listened today on the report from FEMA, some of these rivers are going to enter even higher flood stages come this weekend. And so we're constantly having to watch what's going on and moving resources around so that we can go ahead and provide assistance to survivors. What we do is a lot of sheltering in local churches. We also do that with volunteer sheltering in order to put our teams into the areas. We also have to have a place for them to be housed that then does not impact survivor housing. And so we're very clear about asking our people and then the general public to also not self-deploy into the area when it comes to volunteering, because you take valuable resources and time away from providing services to survivors. In South Carolina, very similar operations are happening in that northeastern portion of the state. And again, there are areas where the rivers are still rising there, and so we're being very cautious as areas are becoming landlocked. And as such, our member organizations, like I said, are already there because every community that I'm aware of across the U.S. has a community of faith in it, and our organizations represent pretty much all the faith walks that there are within the U.S. We continue to go ahead and coordinate our calls along with the governmental agencies, emergency management agencies, to make sure that we as voluntary side, we can react quicker and with less permissions or less restrictions when it comes to providing services to survivors. So we have a much greater degree of flexibility sometimes than government, and we can go ahead and move rather quickly. We have moved a significant amount of commodities within the area. Yesterday, we actually had and today, we've had the support of General Aviation Aircraft from a group called PALS Skyhope Network that has enabled us to actually create an air bridge of commodities from Raleigh and from Charlotte into some of the landlocked areas that have been affected by flooding. So we have some significant capabilities. And then what will happen then is as we transition and the rivers do come down, we will then assist those communities in both the cleanup work, but also in starting to stabilize the community with long-term recovery committees or groups that will form of community members hoping to restore their communities. I want to also remind everybody on the call today that many of these communities are the same ones that were affected by storms over the last 2 years. We've received word that in North Carolina, the majority of the housing that was restored post-Matthew has been reaffected again. And so the mental health needs of these communities is at the forefront as they're re-experiencing the trauma of what they've gone through over the last couple of years. And that includes both North and South Carolina in some of these communities. We want to put out a reminder, again, with volunteering, we've set up a volunteer intake process on our website, which is nvoad.org, and there's instructions there on how to volunteer. We also have a very quick donations page that's there, but that's simply for corporate in-kind donations so that we can go ahead and vet them and make sure that they can get to the proper place. We are discouraging the general public from doing collections of any clothing drives of any sort. What we have found is in disaster zones, this becomes a secondary disaster, and we spend more time sorting through clothing than we do sometimes providing services. And so our partners in National VOAD of Goodwill and Salvation Army do provide vouchers for clothing to survivors post-disaster, and it allows them to go in and actually pick out clean, properly sized clothing without going through bins of less than desirable things. So that's all I have for right now, Bob, to bring you up to date. If there are any questions, I'll take those.
Greg, how do your members go about providing their services? Everything we read about in the newspaper says roads are closed, bridges are down, there's widespread flooding. How do they manage to provide services?
So many of those that are within North Carolina, we actually moved them into the area prior to some of the roads being closed. And so they, many of them have large trucking organizations like Convoy of Hope, Operation Blessing, and a number of others who went in prior to the roads being closed. And then as things open up, they're able to bring additional commodities in. We provided the air bridge yesterday for some leadership and then also some of the supplies to be dropped into the Wilmington area. The airport was open to rotorcraft and general aviation aircraft, just not corporate aircraft. The other is there are still many people that are non-disaster affected within these areas. And so since they belong to local churches and local organizations, we also utilize those community-based voluntary groups to provide additional resources and personnel.
Greg, we appreciate your comments about the right way to handle volunteers and also the donation of products. Do your members have sufficient supplies on hand to handle these immediate needs?
We do. As of right now, we're not identifying any shortfalls. We had pre-staged, and our member organizations run about 40 warehouses across the nation. We have some standardized kits, which are actually quite helpful if people are looking to combine things together. One of the easiest ways is one of our member organizations is UMCOR, the United Methodist Committee on Relief. If you go to the UMCOR website, you'll see relief kits listed there with the items that go in those kits. And there's cleanup buckets, there's health kits or hygiene kits, and school kits. Those three items and kits are actually identical across multiples of our partners and are things that we need all the time in disaster. And so we had quite a bit of those in store in our warehouses, but they'll need to be replenished, and we may run out of them at this point. So that might be a good way to direct people, is look at our list of supplies within those relief kits, and they could collect those specific items, but not necessarily outside of what is listed there.
Greg, one last question. This call today takes place about 1 year after Harvey and Irma and Maria hit, and there's been a lot of other disasters in the meantime as well. And how do voluntary organizations like your members handle the seemingly nonstop onslaught of disasters? Is there stress? Is there lack of volunteer activity? What's going on?
Well, I can say we're tired. We have used an illustration of Team Rubicon, which is one of our newer member organization, newer in that they've been around 7 years or so, and we've been around 50. They addressed 56 different disaster sites last year. So we not only respond to those that make the news, but we also respond to those that don't make the news. And so we're constantly recruiting for new people to join us. The last numbers I have for the number of volunteers that we put into the field was in 2016. And in 2016 alone, and that wasn't a big disaster year, we had 1.7 million volunteers. And so we continue to go ahead and recruit on a continual basis, and then really rely on the communities that are affected too to go ahead and provide volunteers into it to recover their own communities. But as far as we're stretched, we have recovery operations running in Texas and in Puerto Rico, U.S. Virgin Islands, Florida, California. This past week, Wisconsin, heavy flooding through Pennsylvania. And for those of you that don't know, there was 13 confirmed tornadoes that hit Virginia last night.
Okay, we're going to go on to Rhett, but before we do, you mentioned the standard hygiene kits with UMCOR, and we've had a couple of questions about that already. Can you just repeat the information for that?
Sure. If you go to umcor.org, you'll see a link there for relief kits, and you'll be able to download the contents for cleanup buckets, hygiene kits, and also school bags. And the school bags become very critical this time of year as well, because when we look throughout the disaster affected zone, all of those children that just started back to school have now lost all of their school supplies that were in their homes. So those are the three that we are looking at.
So just a reminder to everyone, if you have a question, go to the box at the bottom of the screen, and we'll try to get to your question if we can. We're going to go to Rhett Boney now. She's the Executive Director of North Carolina Network of Grant Makers. Rhett, you must be exhausted, and thank you so much for joining us. My first question is, how are you doing and your family, and how is the staff of the North Carolina Network? Are you all safe?
Yeah, thanks, Bob, and thank you for all that you and your team are doing. Yeah, we thankfully, the staff here and our families, we are all safe. There are some of our family members we've taken in from the Wilmington area, but they are safe. Some damage to homes and things, so we don't know when they'll get back, but could have been much worse, and everyone is safe at the moment. So thank you for asking. I appreciate that.
Well, tell us a little bit about your member organizations, the donor community in North Carolina. What have they been doing the last few days, and what do they have planned for the next week or so?
Yeah, well, you know, as everybody's mentioned so far on the call, this is very much an event in progress. So we don't know the extent of the damage yet, which means that the details of the response from Philanthropy and others will be evolving in the days and weeks and even months to come. You know, as Greg mentioned, many of the areas that were hit by this storm were also hit by Hurricane Matthew less than 2 years ago. So we're compounding disasters here. Recovery was still underway from Matthew, and now we're layering in Florence. I will say that North Carolina we're incredibly fortunate to have a strong network of community foundations here, many of which serve rural areas. And these organizations really are on the front lines right now. And, you know, they're the ones, you know, who are doing the really hard work at the moment. Several have activated their disaster response fund to be able to respond quickly to Florence, to immediate needs for some, as well as mid and longer term needs for others. The Cumberland Community Foundation serves an area where flood level cresting is expected tomorrow. Their disaster fund is up and ready to go. The North Carolina Community Foundation, which operates across the state, has affiliates that cover many of the hardest hit communities, including those you hear about on the news like Wilmington and New Bern, but also some of those more rural areas that have not been covered as much by national media. And, you know, these organizations really are the boots on the ground, so to speak. So a lot of what they're doing now is trying to understand what the needs are, get ready for response, accept donations. They have relationships on the ground, not only with local, potential local donors, but also with the local nonprofits who are going to be doing work on recovery. Those groups are hard at work now. There are links on our website to those community foundations and others that have opened funds. You know, there are other foundations here in North Carolina as well that have a rural focus or who are doing deep work in these communities, and they're paying attention too. And then also say foundations in North Carolina are supporting some very critical organizations across the state who do statewide work to make sure that some of these communities in rural areas don't fall off the radar screen and are not forgotten. But, you know, we really are very much mid-disaster. I don't think we're going to have a full assessment of the damage and the needs until all the rivers have crested. Only then can we really take full stock, and that's still several days away. We're going to continue here at the network to provide updates about the philanthropic response on our website as we get a clear picture of the full scope of the damage. So stay tuned for additional information there.
Rhett, it seems like a lot of the damage is happening in rural areas. So it was good to hear you say that some of your members are focused on the rural areas. Could you say just a little bit more about that?
Yes, so I'll say that, you know, the North Carolina Community Foundation is a statewide foundation with affiliates in many, many counties around the state, including southeastern North Carolina, which is what was hardest hit by this storm. And those affiliate foundations, of course, have, you know, boots on the ground, local folks there who are able to, you know, understand the true needs of those areas. There are also some statewide foundations who have been doing place-based work in some of these, in these communities, and I would expect they're going to be, you know, quite involved in the response. I think it's important to note that many of these areas in southeastern North Carolina, even in the best of times, struggle mightily, high rates of poverty and unemployment. And so, you know, and this is not unique to North Carolina and disasters, I don't believe, but often it's the, you know, the poorest among us, those most vulnerable who live in the areas that continue to get hit. And they don't necessarily have the resources or the networks or the reserves to be able to move out of the path of the next storm. And so, you know, I think we should all keep that in mind when we're thinking about these rural areas of North Carolina. But I am glad, you know, that in North Carolina, we do have some foundations that are, you know, thinking specifically about these regions and have, you know, excellent knowledge of what's needed there and good partnerships with nonprofit organizations on the ground who will be helping with the recovery and rebuilding for, honestly, you know, years to come, I expect.
So, Red, I think you said that you were going to continue to post information on your website about what you learned with needs and what information you're gathering. But we're getting a few questions asking what's the best advice to funders who might want to be engaged in North Carolina. And I guess you're saying we'll have to wait and see.
I think, you know, for certainly the foundations that have disaster relief funds already set up, the community foundations, those are an excellent option. And many of those will be addressing medium and long-term needs as well as the immediate needs. And I think those are organizations that have an excellent understanding of, and will probably have, you know, good early understanding of what the needs are. So I think that is an excellent option. But yes, in terms of, you know, understanding the breadth and depth of need, I think it's still going to be time before we know exactly what that is. You know, many of these rivers are still very much in the rising phase, and so we're not out of the disaster zone yet. And I think it's going to be, you know, days or weeks before we get a real assessment. And I think that philanthropic response is going to evolve as we learn more.
All right, thank you. We've been listening to Rhett Boney. She's the Executive Director of North Carolina Network of Grant Makers. We're going to turn next to Joanne Turnquist. She's the President and CEO of Central Carolina Community Foundation. Joanne, when we were talking before the program began, we said the waters are on the way to South Carolina. So I guess your flooding is still to come. Is that right?
Correct. We have a number of areas that flooded when Florence hit our state, but as Rhett said, now the rivers are filling up, and the rivers are filling up in South Carolina and in North Carolina, and the North Carolina rivers need a path to get to the Atlantic Ocean, and that path comes through central and eastern South Carolina. So we too are waiting to see the full impact while we prepare.
As a foundation that has experienced and worked through disasters before, what were some of the first things you did as Florence prepared to make landfall?
Well, as Rhett said so kindly, thank you, Rhett, about community foundations. Our foundation works with community foundations across the state with the 1SC fund. So one of the things that we started with was to alert all of the individuals and organizations that the 1SC fund application was open and that donations for those affected by Hurricane Florence are being accepted. So we have a broad network from our board to the governor's office to the 1SC Fund Grant Committee, which is made up of business leaders and board representatives from 5 of our state's community foundations that have been impacted by the past 3 disasters to hit our state. We also asked the Grants Committee to be prepared to review grants in the next couple of weeks. We reached out to our community foundation network and funders across our state, and then the community of VOADs and nonprofits that provide disaster recovery, relief, and rebuilding support. And then we also reached out to our local media, which has been extremely supportive in providing different public service announcements and reaching out to those communities that have been hard struck. We've been contacted by a number of interested funders because of the experiences that we've had with the 1,000-year floods and Hurricane Matthews. And so we've been able to connect a number of funders with organizations that can help with the mission that they wish to take care of. And we're working with the South Carolina Disaster Recovery Office to update the SOBI map. And the SOBI map is a social vulnerability map that details the most vulnerable in our state with overlays that include the 2015 floods, Hurricane Matthew, and Hurricane Florence, because much like Rhett's communities, the people that are being affected this time are the same folks that have been affected by the floods and by Hurricane Matthew.
So when the one SC fund was put together in 2015, that was in response to what you call the 1,000-year flood, but the state has kept it open since then to respond to other floods. That might be a model I think we would all be interested in learning more about.
Well, the Community Foundation opened up a disaster recovery fund the Monday following the flooding. And Governor Haley reached out to us because she was getting so many calls from funders across the country asking how they could help our state. So we took on the role with support of other community foundations of housing the fund, handling the administration of the fund. And we do that without taking a fee as a service back to our state. So the first disaster, 24 communities were affected. And the Disaster Recovery Network worked with us and the map that they had developed so that our grants committee could identify those communities that had the greatest need in the highest areas of vulnerability. And that's where our grants were directed. We did the same when Hurricane Matthew came. So again, what we try to do is be the conduit between folks who want to help in our state, using the knowledge that we've amassed and the critical experience we have working with both government agencies and the incredible VOADs who have populated our state since 2014 to ensure that the funds are deployed and tracked accurately.
Thank you. We'll learn some more about this in a little while, but I want to bring Edie Blakesley into the conversation. She's the Vice President of Grant Making and Community Leadership at the Coastal Community Foundation of South Carolina. Edie, I know you work closely with 2 other foundations, and I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about your partnership.
Certainly, I'm glad to. What I can say is this relates directly to what Joanne was just talking about, as well as what Rhett was talking about a few minutes ago, as far as affiliate foundations and working with partners in your footprint. So the Francis P. Bunnell Foundation serves Georgetown County, and then the Waccamaw Community Foundation serves Georgetown and Horry County. So they're the boots on the ground. I think somebody used that phrase earlier. There's staff there, and the key part is that they really understand community, and they have built strong relationships with the nonprofit organizations that serve people throughout the year, regardless of when, if there's a disaster. And where this really comes into play, especially during disaster time, is when everybody then goes into disaster mode and really into the VOADs, where they're very active, they step in quickly, they try to meet needs immediately, they open up shelters, they provide food, sometimes mobile feeding programs. So the nonprofits who are here all of the time doing really important work throughout the year then gear up and they go into disaster mode with the VOADs, working with FEMA and others to really, step in and fill in that really very critical need. We do have staff. Actually, half of the staff has not been able to make it back to the area because they did evacuate when the evacuation order was given, and half of the staff is still there. My understanding is that there is one roadway 501 that's still partially, you can go back and forth on it, but that flooding is increasing, so getting in or out is going to be increasingly difficult.
All right, well, thank you very much. That was Edie Blakesley, Vice President of Grant Making and Community Leadership at the Coastal Community Foundation of South Carolina. I want to get a better sense from the group what's likely to happen in the next week or two or a month. So this is, once we're past this rescue stage, what happens in the next month or so? And Eric, maybe you could get us started, and then Greg go second, and then the rest of you are welcome to join in.
So one of the things that we at FEMA will be doing is working with our state counterparts to identify housing solutions for individuals that may be in the shelters presently, but are unable to return to their homes. And trying to identify how can we make certain that there is safe, secure, and sanitary roof over people's heads. We'll continue to work with our nonprofit partners to be able to deliver food, water, and other commodities to ensure that people who may have lost everything have those essentials and are provided for. So we're taking a look with our state's counterparts what are the different options of assistance that we can provide to them and support them as they become implemented across the state. Again, as I mentioned, there is the individual assistance declaration for 18 of the states, 18 of the counties within North Carolina. And as damage assessments continue, we may see that there's more counties that are going to be eligible for that assistance. So we're going to continue to do damage assessments, especially as the flooding subsides. And then moving down the road, as you're talking about, we're going to be supporting our VOAD partners in the creation and establishment of long-term recovery committees and help guide them and work with National VOAD and how to set these up so the community is able to take care of their recovery and be able to support those that were affected by Hurricane Florence.
Greg, how about from your perspective? What happens the next 30, 60 days?
Well, our community-based resources will solidify, and so we'll actually set up volunteer camps so that we can receive teams on an ongoing basis. Most of the times our groups will stay a week at a time, and so we'll look for those communities that have been most highly affected. and we'll set up volunteer camps in those areas to be able to do cleanup work. We can sometimes bring the houses back to at least a shelter standard. So when it comes to temporary shelter, as Eric was referring to, there's a couple of different programs within FEMA, and so we're exploring with them on how we might be able to restore some houses that have received minimal damage but still can't be occupied until they're cleaned out, and we can help dry those down and make them rehabitable for people. Then what will happen is the long-term recovery groups will get stood up, so we'll work with those. And then we'll also start looking at, right now, there's what we call casework that goes on. So when people come into shelters, there's a minimal amount of information that is taken from them. As they register with FEMA, there's additional information that is taken there. In the beginning parts of this, in the first month, it's casework. And so we see if we can refer people to resources that'll help them recover what they need for right now. And then we'll set up a strategy for long-term disaster case management that actually helps families then that have more ongoing needs to develop a recovery plan for them and their family.
All right, thank you. Rhett, a question from the audience. What do you recommend or foresee for funders' involvement in the long-term recovery, the months and the years to come?
That's a great question. And as I think ahead, I know our community foundations are going to be engaged for the long haul, and I think that the foundations that we have in North Carolina working in these rural areas will be as well. What I would encourage funders to think about, I think, many funders don't think of themselves necessarily as disaster funders per se, and yet I would encourage them to think that whether you consider yourself to be one or not, the people and the places that you support will be affected by tragedies like Hurricane Florence and others that I'm sure will come. So, just taking Hurricane Florence as an example, we no doubt are going to see some educational outcomes that will suffer, for our children and young people as a result of this. We're also going to see, some immediate and perhaps longer-term health outcomes that will suffer. Certainly, there are some serious environmental impacts to the flooding that we're seeing from the rivers, and the list goes on. So, I would encourage funders to think carefully and consider what their own roles and approaches might be within the missions that they have for themselves. So, how might they make some kind of a response to this and other disasters. Part of what they're thinking about is they're trying to, address outcomes for the people and places that they care about.
Joanne or Edie, anything to add to that? What should donors be thinking in terms of the long-term recovery?
This is Joanne. I'd add two things based on our experience. We're still funding and supporting individuals getting back in their houses after 2015. And if funders can broaden their scope of funding to include things like temporary housing, not just for the people displaced, but for the volunteers that are coming in. Greg mentioned, having tent programs coming in, et cetera, Eric did. And ensuring that the volunteers that are willing to pick up a hammer, the skilled labor that is willing to run the electric lines, have a place that's safe to stay so they're not commuting 2 and 3 hours to get to the disaster space, as well as thinking about the infrastructure needs of the organizations to ensure that they have adequate staff, that they're getting trained in these types of areas so that when the next disaster strikes, we're more prepared.
Yeah, this is Edie, and I couldn't agree more about the capacity piece of it. Funders often will say, oh, well, we fund poverty alleviation, or we fund community-based organizations, or, whatever. And if they could think a little bit more about what those nonprofits do day to day, but how important it is for them to have the capacity to respond when their resources are stretched during a crisis time. I think that is really important. So the training piece is key. Understanding that organizations can join the VOADs and be part of that team that helps meet the need in a collaborative way, rather than trying to do something externally or outside of those groups. And then the only other thing I would add to that is, oftentimes if foundations or individual donors can think about how to build capacity and think about building assets or wealth creation or increasing opportunity for populations or people that are often overlooked, I think that's really a key piece. I was talking earlier with colleagues today about people who work and have to rely on paycheck week after week were out of work for a week. So they not only had to evacuate or shelter in place, but they also didn't receive a paycheck. So if we can sort of flip that during the year and think about how to build that asset creation, that wealth development, how to help people be a little bit more resilient, I think that's a really positive thing. And that way it does help national funders and other individual donors think differently about their philanthropy.
So it's interesting. We started this conversation talking about the immediacy of Hurricane Florence and the disaster it's caused in the Carolinas. But here we are now, 45 minutes later, and all of you from the funding community are really talking in a more holistic, long-term kind of a way and seeing disasters and our response to disasters as a piece of something much bigger. Is that where you're going?
Well,
go ahead.
Well, this is Edie again. I'll jump in and I'll say that, I think we have been, and in some cases it's intentional, and in some cases it's just happenstance. But for example, on this call, Joanne, my colleague up in Columbia, invited us to the table during the 1SC fund. And rather than being territorial about who was giving money where, she asked us to participate in that, as well as all the other community foundations. Rhett, you mentioned your colleagues, the North Carolina Community Foundation. They were the ones that I reached out to immediately. We do have a disaster relief recovery fund here, but we also put them up on our website to help people think a little bit more collaboratively about how we do this work. And yes, it's super important right now during the immediate build up to the aftermath, but it's also incredibly important after the case. I know Joanne's group just issued a report about houses that still needed repair from Hurricane Matthew, which also had some from the historic flooding. So I think that we need to think about this differently in the philanthropic space. Community foundations, private foundations, United Ways, all of us who do this work. Because I can't remember, Greg, if it was you or Eric who said that, we can be a little bit more flexible than government. And philanthropy can absolutely be a little bit more flexible and nimble and try to respond in a more strategic, collaborative way. And I think we need to lead that rather than, just have it happen as part of happenstance.
One of the suggestions too with funders, I noted a number of questions. The state agencies that do this work have tremendous resources of information. And in South Carolina, as mentioned, the South Carolina Disaster Recovery Office has worked very, very closely with VOADs and long-term recovery groups. And that information that they provide to the funding networks throughout our state, the community foundations and elsewhere, have really helped us to take a look at the most vulnerable. And that informs our work during disaster, but it has also really helped inform our work after disaster. So I think all of us are in agreement that this is a tip of an iceberg type of a thing that really does provide an illustration into longer term needs.
This is Rhett. One of the things that occurs to me is that given how, frequently we're getting 1,000-year storms or 1,000-year flooding, it's starting to feel like we no longer have the luxury of addressing these disasters one at a time. we've yet to recover, as many have said, from Matthew, and now Florence is here. So it feels like we also need to be, thinking about how we, consider, our planning and our response. We need to be doing several things simultaneously, preparing for what may come next while we're dealing with immediate response to ongoing and recent disasters, while we're still in long-term recovery and rebuilding from past disasters. So it may be that there's some, thinking about different kinds of planning and processes that may need to take place, since we are in a kind of this rapid succession of disaster after disaster.
So one of the questions we received was someone asking if any of you are engaged in planning and preparation funding. Is there more things we can be doing to get ready for disasters and to be better prepared? Any of you doing things before disaster strikes that we can learn from?
This is Joanne. One of the things that we've done with the help of some incredible organizations, SBP, for example, out of New Orleans, is we have sent local organizations who work in recovery and rebuilding to their shop for 2- and 3-week training sessions after a disaster, so in between floods, if you will. So when they come back, they are more prepared to lead their organizations and then begin training others within our state, so that we're doing more home growing to support those VOADs that come in from elsewhere. And funders might think about doing that type of funding. How could we fund the building of experience, and how can we build a more ready workforce to address these issues?
So this is Greg, if I can jump in on that. So one of the moves that we're making with National VOAD and through our state VOAD agencies is actually moving towards what we're calling a COAD model, which is community organizations active in disaster, or county organizations. And part of it is to educate there on the very local level, but also be very inclusive of the community organizations that are engaged. And not only though it has disaster in the title, we're really looking at it as disasters affect communities all the time, whether it's a single house fire or somebody losing a car. So if we can, we'll expand our definition of a disaster on a very localized basis. The other thing that it will enable us to do is actually put resources then into the development of those COADs and still have them connected back to the state organization, back to the national group. So we're doing capacity building in addition to providing services to the immediacy of the need.
All right, thank you. We've got about 5 minutes left here, and I'd like to give each of you an opportunity to say a few last remarks. And I want you to pay particular attention to the question of what can donors who are listening today, what should they be thinking about, and when should they get involved? And let's start, Eric, with you.
Okay. Long-term recovery is just that. It's long-term. Recovery takes a lot of time. We've talked, everyone has emphasized that, people are still recovering from the floods and from Hurricane Matthew. And many communities impacted by Florence, they're going to be recovering for years. I love the idea of funders getting more involved with preparedness, but keep in mind that 2 years, 3 years down the road, there's still going to be unmet needs from this disaster. And really thinking about, it's not just rebuilding the homes and the dwellings, but it's helping to rebuild the lives of the people, and that we take care of them in a very holistic sort of way.
All right, thank you. So that was Eric Nankervis from FEMA. Thank you so much, Eric. Greg Forrester from National VOAD.
Certainly, yeah, I'm really pleased with the way this conversation went. It's the needs are not only in the immediacy, but also in the long term. And then assisting those organizations with not only the response work and pigeonholing funding, but making funding much more broad-based is really helpful. Because we may have some funders who identify a very specific need, and then we have to use the funds for that specific need, whether or not it rises to the top for that day. So as funders, as you're looking at it, make it a little more broader based rather than extremely defined. And also look at your time periods from immediately all the way through to 3 to 5 years out from now, and look for the greater results in that long-term investment. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Greg. Joanne Turnquist from Central Carolina Community Foundation.
Thanks, Bob. I would echo what Greg and Eric have said, and I would add to that as funders take a look at what they can do, in order to allow the local organizations that are working to do the recovery and long-term building, provide funding today and continue to provide funding 4 years from now. Our rule of thumb with our fund is that 20% of what we have can go to immediate needs, but we need to ensure that we have 80% of what we think we're going to gain through fundraising for that long term. And we need everyone to participate, short and long.
All right, thank you. Joanne Turnquist from Central Carolina Community Foundation. Edie Blakesley, a few last remarks.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I would say that for donors, I would encourage them to call their local community foundation. I promise it's not a plug for a community foundation in general, but what I will say is they generally know what's going on the ground, and they also understand the evolving nature of a disaster, and things are changing regularly, minute by minute often. So I would say, reaching out to your community foundation in the area that you're interested in is absolutely essential. I can't underscore Eric's comment about the stick-to-itiveness. Joanne mentioned it too, about giving now, but keep on giving. Unfortunately, somebody will give a gift and then they'll think that they're done, and it's very generous and it's wonderful. But if they could also come back and give again, that's what's going to help with the long-term effort, so that if it's 2 years or 3 years instead of 6 or 7 years. And then the only other last thing I can say is I would love to have donors think about what areas are vulnerable. I know that Rhett mentioned the rural areas. I think that's hugely important, especially because they often lack resources and connections that urban settings have. So those were the 3 for me.
Thank you. Red Boney from North Carolina. Last comments, please.
Thanks, Bob. I mean, I really want to echo what everyone else has said. Donor fatigue is real. And the headlines that we're reading now and the pictures that we're looking at that are moving us so deeply, those are going to disappear in a little while. But the needs that they represent, it's going to take years for those to go away. So please don't lose focus. So just, hang in there with us. The other thing I would encourage is for funders who are going to be giving grants to organizations that you trust and that are doing good work on the ground, consider general operating support so that they have, the flexibility to address the needs as they see them as boots on the ground in their local communities.
All right, well, thank you very much. Just a few last remarks. We also have a 2018 Atlantic Hurricane Season Recovery Fund. This is focused on the full season of disasters to come. Our experience, again, to echo those of our panelists, has been to focus on the medium and the very, very long-term needs of this disaster and those other to come. And you can learn more about this fund on our website. We also have lots of information about what to do before, during, and after disasters if you're a donor. And you can look at our disaster playbook, and you can see the website here. A reminder for all of us, our friends at the Foundation Center have been tracking private institutional response to date for Florence. This is as of yesterday. And it's been a disappointing $24 million raised, including nearly $20 million by company-sponsored foundations, 1 million from private foundations, and a little over 3 million by 3 public charities. We're hoping there is more to come. You've heard many good opportunities for you to contribute today. I hope those of you listening to this program will be thinking about that. Unfortunately, we've now run out of time for today's webinar. We want to thank Eric, Greg, Rhett, Edie, and Joanne for just amazing insights and comments today. Special thanks again to the UPS Foundation for hosting this webinar and to our co-sponsors, the Council on Foundations, the Southeast Council of Foundations, the Environmental Grantmaker Association, and the Funders Network for Smart Growth and Livable Communities. And thanks to all of you today for joining us. Thank you and good afternoon.